Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Momma Murdered A Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Momma Murdered A Podcast, we'll be covering the mysterious disappearance and murder of a 17-year-old who was just walking home from his girlfriend's house where he had snuck out for the night to visit. He had done this after a school dance. And this week we're going to dive into the unsolved case of 17-year-old Blake Chappell. And for this episode, I did something entirely different than what I would normally do. I usually try to avoid listening to any podcast on any case that I plan to cover in the near future until I've done my own research. But in this case, I did actually use 2 different podcasts to help with my research. Of course, I still did my own independent research, but during my research, these 2 podcasts just kept coming up. And what better way to hear a case than from the mother of that missing child? I also used these 2 podcasts solely because they were interviews with Blake's mom, Melissa. Those 2 podcasts are called Missing, and the second one is called Voices for Justice, which is a podcast by Sarah Turney, who is Alyssa Turney's sister. And if you haven't heard of Alyssa Turney's case, definitely go look into it. Both of these podcasts are available virtually everywhere you already listen to podcasts at, and I'm going to link all 3 of the episodes that I used concerning Blake's case below. I'm going to link those in the description box or the show notes under the description of the episode. That way you can go listen to them yourself when you're done here. So, with all of that being said, let's get it. Blake Tyler Chappell was born in 1994 on February 7th to his parents, Melissa and Michael. Which is weird because that's only a year after I was born and 7 days sooner. So I would only be like a year and a week older than Blake. And my mom's name is also Melissa. Blake was typical and all boy. He loved riding anything with wheels, dirt bikes, four-wheelers, bicycles, skateboards, you name it. But he also loved to fish, and he also loved rap music. Blake was the kind of guy that was friends with literally everybody and the kind of guy that swooned all the ladies where he lived in Georgia. Blake was also athletic and he played sports, but he also loved to kick back and play video games. He was especially good at the game Guitar Hero. Blake could play the song Carry On My Wayward Son on Guitar Hero on the hardest difficulty level with his back facing away from the game or the screen that shows you what notes to hit and when. This was something he was proud of, and that's something extremely hard to do. If you've ever played Guitar Hero, you know what I mean. Blake was so good at Guitar Hero that his friends kind of joked and dubbed him the Master of Guitar Hero, which is an honorary title to carry as a teenage boy in 2011. And I know this is something that is said so often in cases where something tragic happens unexpectedly to somebody, but Blake was quite literally the kind of guy that lit up every room that he walked into. His smile was infectious, and he was reportedly the best kind of funny. He could not only make anybody laugh, but he tried his best to do so every chance he got. Blake had somehow mastered the bad boy look with the sweetheart personality that many men still haven't quite figured out. Blake had also gotten a small Playboy bunny tattoo on the top of his chest, and it had to have been something that he did without his mom knowing, because he was only 17 at the time of his death. He rocked the skinny jeans and the big skateboarding shoes, he loved rap music, and his swooshy Justin Bieber-style haircut. And Blake was going through that phase as a teenager where he's finding any way to express himself while he's also trying to figure out what kind of person he wants to be in life in general. He had the snake bite piercings, which is where his bottom lip would have been pierced on both sides, and he was freaking adorable. So cute, so handsome. 16-year-old me would have tried to wipe Blake up, not even gonna lie. I probably would have drooled on Blake in science class. He was freaking adorable. And when I say Blake was trying to figure out what kind of person he wanted to be in life, and that he was trying to find himself, I mean that he had actually written, by hand, a bucket list with 100 things on it that he had planned and wanted to do before he died. Some of those things listed on the bucket list show where Blake's head and mindset was at. Like, he had written things down like, get closer to your brother, and hug your mom like you've never hugged her before. Tell someone how you really feel about them. And the last thing that I'll read from his bucket list is probably the one that broke my heart the most, because it said become a grandfather. How many teenagers do you know that are already thinking about and wanting to be grandparents? Blake was obviously looking forward to living his best life, and he had planned to live it so much further than he was actually able to go. And then there were, normal things on this bucket list that said, stay one night in a mansion, buy a pack of cigarettes legally, move into your own place, get your license and buy your own car. And sadly, Blake wouldn't get the chance to do any of those amazing things that he had planned for himself or his life. He had dreamed of either becoming an attorney or a news anchor, and he had even taken broadcasting classes in high school to try to learn as much as he could about the broadcasting field. But he'd never get to experience either of those career choices either, because Blake's life was taken from him and Blake was taken from his family so much sooner than what me and most would consider fair. But there were a few things that had happened surrounding Blake and his safety in the months leading up to his death, and people often wonder if those events and circumstances didn't have something to do with what happened to Blake and the way that he was found. So I want to go over these events because they seem to be extremely relevant in this case, and you can't really look into this case without this same series of events being brought up literally everywhere. Blake had a girlfriend named Skylar, and Skylar seemed to come from a rougher kind of upbringing than Blake as far as family goes. Her stepdad was a tough love, suck it up, rub some dirt in it kind of guy, and people that knew Skylar's family said that Skylar and her mom kind of had to walk on eggshells around him. And as we'll find out a little bit later on in this case, Skylar's stepdad isn't the greatest guy, but that's besides the point. And Skylar had, she had lived through her own struggles, but Blake wasn't a stranger to living through his own hard times either. The only difference was that Blake had an incredible family during his harder times. Blake's mom, Melissa, had suffered from a stroke, and the family was forced to move to Noonan, Georgia. His mom's health made it where the family went through their own struggles financially, but they did always have each other, even when they didn't have much else at the time. They were forced to sleep in their car for a few months or so, but sleeping in the family car seemed to kind of open Blake's eyes as to how the simple things in life can be so easily taken for granted. Blake had even written an essay as a school project about how the time that he had spent having to sleep in the family car made him so much more grateful for the things that they did have. And I just wanted to share a few sentences from the writing assignment that Blake had turned in. The paper was titled Poverty, and the first line said, quote, "People in this world live day to day and alone, while most of us flaunt our money and just spend it like it's nothing. I do not understand it." And the last few lines of this essay that Blake was assigned to write said, quote, "Believe it or not, I used to be poor. I lived for 3 months without a house, without a sense of stability or security. I felt as if I was a 30-year-old man at times, stuck in a horrible dream where everything I had was taken from me. My mom and I eventually found our security here in Georgia, and I'm so thankful for everything I have now. I have a sense of sympathy for those who have to live every single day like I had to." So instead of taking this experience and using it as a crutch or an excuse to make poor decisions or choices, Blake used it as a way to look at the world differently, and it taught him to feel sympathy for others and empathy for those in a worse situation than what he was in, no matter what had put them in their situation. Blake had taken this entire experience and learned from it, but he was still only 17 years old. He was also a boy with raging hormones and a pretty girlfriend who needed saving. And somewhere around May 2011, his girlfriend, Skylar, she did what most teenage girls in rough home lives do. She tried to run away from home. And I was never able to dig up why she wanted to run away or if anything had happened to cause it, because sometimes teenagers do dumb shit. Trust me, I was that teen. So when Skylar's mom called Blake's mom to see if maybe Skylar had been hiding out at Blake's house, Blake's mom let her know that Skylar hadn't been there with Blake at the house that day. And Blake's mom, Melissa, also told Skylar's mom that she hadn't seen her and wasn't sure where she might be. Skylar's mom told Melissa that Skylar had written on their TV screen something along the lines of like, "I hate you, bitch," or something super teenagey and dramatic like that, and that she was gone and they didn't know where she was. And it was only a little while later when Skylar's mom called Melissa again on their landline phone, and this time it was to let her know that Skylar's stepdad, Earl, was out looking for Blake. But Skylar's stepdad, Earl, wasn't just out looking for Blake, though. He was also allegedly asking people if they'd seen Blake and lifting up one side of his shirt to reveal a gun. And telling everybody that if they saw Blake, to let him know that Earl, quote-unquote, had something for him. Because Skylar's stepdad was convinced that she was with Blake, even though Blake's mom had already told Skylar's mom that the two weren't together. And this little bit about, quote-unquote, having something for Blake while he's actively showing people a holstered gun on his hip seems super relevant after Blake's body is found the way it's found. So now we have Blake, who was out and about, roaming the neighborhood, hanging out at his friend's house, and his girlfriend Skylar, who had run away from home, and now we have Skylar's crazy-ass stepdad Earl, who seems to be making, threatening comments with a gun about finding Blake. But Blake does eventually catch wind about Skylar running away from home and about Earl being on the prowl for him. And Blake decides to leave his friend's house, who he had been spending the night with for the last couple nights. And Blake hopped on his bicycle to go try to find Skylar. And according to Blake's mom, Blake had just planned to try to talk her into going back home to kind of save her from the wrath of her stepdad. Because Blake knew how Earl was, and I feel like we all knew somebody with a stepdad like Earl growing up, or maybe it was just me. But Blake's mom, Melissa, and the police report say two completely different things about this incident between Earl and Blake. The police report claims that Blake was found with Skylar hiding out in a wooded area, trying not to be seen by searching parents or authorities. And this claimed report will come back up, so just keep that little nugget of information in your memory bank for later. And I keep saying claimed for a reason. Blake's mom, Melissa, says that Skylar's mom had called her again, and at this point was just kind of laughing, saying that she had let Earl know that she thought Blake was with Skylar and that he was out looking for Blake. And what all this boils down to is the fact that when Earl did find Blake, he was actually with Skylar at this point. But Melissa says that she had talked to Blake after this incident and that Blake had told her he was just trying to calm Skylar down and try to talk her into going back home. Regardless of why Blake had met up with Skylar, he was found with Skylar. And when Blake had finally met up with Skylar to try to talk her into going back home, Blake couldn't quite figure out how Skylar had managed to get his clothes out of his room inside of his house without him knowing. Because when he met up with Skylar, she was wearing his clothes, but it was clothes that Blake hadn't given her to wear. So this wasn't like a cute high school boyfriend giving his girlfriend a hoodie or a football jersey to wear because it smelled like him. No, this was something else. Because Blake hadn't given Skylar the clothes that she was wearing that belonged to him, and he didn't know how she'd even got them. And the reason I kept saying that the way that Blake and Skylar were found was a claim and nothing more is because, according to one statement that says the two were spotted by Skylar's stepdad riding on Blake's bicycle through the park. Skylar was riding on the back pegs while Blake was the one actually pedaling the bike. But another statement says that the two were found in the wooded area hiding. Either way, they were found, and when Earl happened upon the two together, he completely lost his shit. Because on May 28, 2011, a police report from Clayton County says that officers were sent out to Blake's house where they found that he had been assaulted by his girlfriend's stepdad, Earl. There were witnesses that did actually come forward saying that they had been approached by Earl showing off his big scary gun and threatening a 17-year-old teenage boy by saying things along the lines of, "I've got something for him," or "Tell him I'm looking for him," or, what have you. Earl had seen Skylar with Blake, and when he flagged him down to stop him, Earl gets out to where Blake and Skylar were, and he knocks Blake off his bicycle. He proceeds to pistol whip him with a few of his other grown-ass friends standing around watching all of this happen. Not one of these grown-ass men tried to stop Earl from beating the absolute shit out of Blake, allegedly. Also allegedly, Blake was kicked in the face and ribs multiple times, even though Blake was already down on the ground. Earl then threw his stepdaughter Skylar into either the trunk of the vehicle or into the bed of the truck. I've seen, read, and heard both of those, so I'm not sure one way or the other. But Skylar was taken and thrown into a vehicle by her stepdad, that part we do know. Skylar would later say that her stepdad didn't throw her into the trunk of his car. When the police and paramedics arrived to where Blake was, he absolutely refused to go to the hospital. He didn't care if it was an ambulance or if, somebody was going to take him. Either way, he was worried about how much the ambulance bill or the medical bills would cost his mom, so he absolutely would not go. Which I feel like that says everything you need to know about Blake. He refused to go to the hospital to be treated for his wounds from an assault on him by a grown-ass man because he was worried that his mom would get stuck with the medical bills. What other 17-year-old do you know that's worried about their mom paying medical bills? None. That's how many. First responders let Blake know that he very likely had a concussion, and yet he still refused medical attention. And as far as the clothes that Skylar had been wearing when Earl found the two of them together, Blake's mom said that Blake and Skylar had broken up just a few days before the assault on Blake, and after they had broken up, Skylar had stopped by Blake's house one day when he wasn't home. She told Blake's mom, Melissa, that she was just dropping some of Blake's stuff off and picking some of her stuff up since they had broken up. But it seems like when Skylar had taken Blake's things back to his room, that maybe that's when she had grabbed the clothes that she was later found in when her stepdad caught her and Blake together. It almost seems like this assault was kind of planned and orchestrated as a means of revenge, allegedly. The assault case was handed over to a detective who was supposed to be looking into what happened between Blake and his ex-girlfriend's stepdad, Earl. And it was only a few days later when Melissa got a call from the Jonesboro Police Department, and the man on the phone asked Melissa, if she can kind of walk him through the events of the day that Blake was assaulted. And when she's done telling this officer what had happened, she also tells this officer that Earl had gone back to where the assault on Blake had happened and had threatened all the kids that had been there and witnessed the assault, saying that they'd better not say a word or, there would be hell to pay, however it was worded. But after Melissa told the officer on the phone about Earl going back and threatening the kids into not saying anything, the officer asked her why in the world Earl would do that, which is weird. But we'll come back to this. So after the officer talks to Melissa, he asks if he can speak with Blake for a few minutes about the incident. Blake talks to the officer, and that's when the call's over. The officer tells Melissa that he'll be in touch, and they hang up. But then it was 2 whole last weeks after that first call that Melissa got another call from a Jonesboro Police Department officer. This time, though, it was an officer that was in charge of Blake's case. The officer even goes on to, apologize to Melissa for taking so long to get in touch with her, and then he explains that he'd been on vacation for the last week or so. Melissa tries to tell this officer that she and Blake had already spoken to one officer that was supposed to be in charge of Blake's case, and that they did want to go ahead and press charges on Earl for the assault on Blake. But the officer that called the second time was adamant that there was no other officer that would have been looking into Blake's case, and that he had no idea who would have called Melissa before him. Melissa's not stupid, though. She goes to her phone company and she gets a print off of all the calls that have been made to and from her house. And while she's going through the list of numbers, she allegedly finds Earl's name and number listed on the same day at the same time that the first quote-unquote officer had called to talk to her and Blake. Which is probably, allegedly, maybe why the first officer that called their house would have been asking why Earl would threaten kids to keep quiet. Blake and Melissa, neither one recognized Earl's voice during the first call. Melissa believes that Earl was calling, pretending to be this officer to try to see what they knew or what they had planned on saying to the police. Nonetheless, this real officer asked Melissa to come into the sheriff's office and to bring Blake down to the station with her so they can go ahead and close out the case, even though Melissa had made it very clear that she wanted to press charges, that she didn't just want the case closed. So she and Blake go to the station and they try to clear up the confusion and figure out what the hell is going on, if nothing else. And when Blake and Melissa get to the station, the officer comes out and introduces himself to them, and he asks Blake if he's ready to go in for questioning. But Blake had already told Melissa that he wanted her to go with him if they wanted to talk to him about anything. When Blake tells the officer that he wants his mom to go with him, the officer tells Melissa that Blake was 17 years old, that he was old enough to go in and speak to police by himself, and that she could wait in the waiting room for them to be done. He would bring him back out when they were done. The officer assures both Blake and Melissa that they would only be gone for a few minutes and that they'd be right back. But when the officer came back 3.5 hours later, Blake wasn't with him. Blake had been charged and arrested for custodial interference, which is basically just a charge for interfering with the custody or placement of a kid intentionally. And since Blake was 16 and his girlfriend Skylar was 17, they considered Blake an adult and Skylar a minor, and they charged Blake as an adult. Blake spent 16 or 17 days in jail for this shit, and from what I could find, absolutely nothing happened to Earl for the assault charges that Melissa was trying to push for to begin with. And even though the statement that Blake gave the police about the incident matched the statements of all of Blake's friends and all the witnesses that, they had given about what had happened, it just seems like the police department and the investigators let what Blake and his friends said fall by the wayside in one ear and out the other, and they must have believed Earl over Blake and his friends. I'm not sure. That's the only way that Blake being charged and Earl walking free really makes any sense. Because when Earl was questioned about the events of the day, he says that he doesn't even own a gun because he's a felon and that would be illegal. Which, obviously, he's not going to own up to having a gun if he knows damn well that he isn't supposed to touch a gun, much less be in possession of one. Earl also denied ever threatening the kids to keep quiet, and he says that he never went around flashing a gun on his hip when he was first out looking for Blake and asking people if they'd seen him. And I guess it doesn't help that Skylar kind of backed up her stepdad's story to the police when they questioned her about the assault on Blake. But, if she wasn't comfortable enough telling the truth, then I could see why she would lie. That makes sense to me as a 16-year-old. And while Blake was in jail for those 16 or 17 days, a lady came in to speak with Blake and to kind of get his side of the story about what had happened. And undoubtedly, Blake had mistakenly thought that this woman that he was talking to was his defense attorney. But she was actually the prosecuting attorney, and during that visit with the prosecution, Blake must have said some incriminating things to her, thinking that she was his defense attorney. You're supposed to tell them everything, the truth, whatever. But that must have gotten cleared up too, because later the prosecution told Blake and Melissa that they had planned on dropping the charges against Blake when he was due back for his next court date. So once Blake's out of jail, Melissa uproots her kids, and they move to Coweta County in Georgia. And I'm going to try to say the name of this town. So Sonoya. I won't say it again, though. They moved with Melissa's boyfriend, and they did this in the hopes of keeping Blake safe and off of Earl's radar. Earl had allegedly been harassing the family and stalking them, according to Blake's mom, Melissa, and they had actually picked up and moved during the middle of the night in hopes that nobody would even see them moving to be able to tell Earl where they had gone to. Once they settled into life in Coweta County, Blake was pretty reclusive and didn't go out much at first, and, that wasn't until school started. Once he was back in the classroom and surrounded by people his own age and in an environment that he was used to, Blake was right back in his element. He started making friends. He'd even moved on from Skylar and gotten himself a new girlfriend. This girlfriend's name is Ryan, and Blake seemed to be head over heels for this new girl, Ryan. He was smitten by her and amazed by her, and he just thought that they'd always be perfect for one another. It was teenage love. So when the homecoming dance was scheduled, Blake and his new girlfriend Ryan had every intention of going together. But first, Blake had to get prepped for this dance with his new boo thing. Blake's mom had driven him to the Kohl's department store to get a tie to match his girlfriend Ryan's dress for the homecoming dance. Blake and his girlfriend had actually gone back and forth about the color of the tie, which one was the one that would match her dress the best for a while. And while Blake was in the store, Blake's mom, Melissa, had stayed out in the car waiting on Blake to get what he needed. She also says that she had given Blake a good bit of his own child support every month to kind of do with what he wanted, and that he had just gotten himself a cell phone with his own money. She says that he would do things like buy energy drinks to resell at school at a higher price in order to make some extra cash for things that he wanted. So he would have had money for certain things like a cell phone that he'd just gotten himself. It would make sense that he would have his own money. Melissa waited in the car, and Blake was inside of the store for maybe an hour and a half just trying to find the perfect tie. And he'd finally found the right color, and he and his girlfriend agreed on it, and Blake had asked a man that was working at the Kohl's store if he could tie the tie for him because he didn't know how. Which is adorable. After Blake and Ryan had gotten dressed, it was time for them to do all the other teenage dance things. The young couple met up, they took pictures at Ryan's parents' house, and afterwards, Melissa had driven Blake and his new girlfriend Ryan to a sushi restaurant, and then back to Blake's girlfriend's house. At Ryan's house, they started a movie before they were dropped off at the dance around 7:30. They had kind of had an early dinner, so they just needed to kill a little bit of time. And if this isn't the cutest, most high school thing I've ever seen, then I don't know what is. They had to have their parents drive them to each other's house, then to the restaurant for their date, only to be picked back up from the restaurant and dropped off at school where they were, where the dance was taking place. Now, the dance was over at about 10 p.m., so Blake had gone back to Ryan's house to finish the movie that they had started earlier after their dinner date. And once they finished their movie, Ryan's mom drove Blake back to his friend Austin's house. And when Blake got back to Austin's house, he called his mom to tell her what an amazing night he'd had, and, he just told her how they'd laughed and danced and just lived their absolute best high school lives all in one night. Blake even told his mom, Melissa, that this dance had probably been the best night of his life. But that wasn't the only reason that Blake had called his mom that night after the dance, though. He was also calling to ask if he could spend the night at Austin's house. And Melissa was kind of apprehensive about letting Blake stay at somebody's house, especially since the shit had just happened with his ex-girlfriend Skylar and her stepdad. And Blake hadn't stayed at anybody else's house since the incident with Earl had happened. So Melissa thought about whether or not she was ready to let Blake get back to being a normal teenager again or not, and since she had been so overprotective of him since the assault had just happened back in Jonesboro, but they had moved to get a fresh start, so since, she had decided Blake could stay the night at Austin's house under one condition, that he and Austin stay put at the house and not to go anywhere for the rest of the night, not to leave Austin's house for any reason under any circumstance. And Blake agreed. He told his mom that he loved her and they hung up the phone. And this would be the last time that Melissa would ever get to speak to her son again. After Blake had hung up with his mom, just like every other teenager in the world, Blake and Austin did leave Austin's house that night. They headed to a local gas station where they tried to buy cigarettes, and of course their attempt was unsuccessful. So the two boys headed back to Austin's house for the night. They hung out, they talked to a few friends, and they relived the events of the night at the dance. Austin was ready to lay it down and call it a night, and Blake had kind of been joking all night about sneaking out of Austin's house to go see his girlfriend Ryan. Austin didn't really think that Blake was serious until Blake came in to wake Austin up to let him know that he was leaving out to go to Ryan's house. This was like 2 a.m.-ish. He had just planned to go to visit with her for a little while, and then he'd sneak back into Austin's house. So Blake left Austin's house around 2, maybe 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning on October 16th to start the walk to his girlfriend Ryan's house. Austin had given Blake one of his jackets to wear on the walk to his girlfriend's house because it was freezing cold outside, and Austin had also given Blake a key to his house. That way Blake wouldn't wake his parents up when he came back in from sneaking in at Ryan's house. And what I find so weird about this is that when Blake made it to Ryan's house, and, later after Blake's body was found, he wasn't wearing the jacket that Austin had given him. And the jacket that Austin had let him borrow was never found or seen again. Blake did make the walk to his girlfriend's house that night, and it was somewhere around a 3-mile walk from Austin's house where Blake was spending the night to his girlfriend Ryan's house. And nobody's really sure which route Blake took to get to Austin's house because there are a few different ways he could have gone and made it there on foot in a reasonable amount of time. But Blake did eventually make it to Ryan's house where he did the most rom-com thing I've ever seen, and he snuck through Ryan's windows to wake her up and surprise her. Blake hung out with Ryan at her house for a little while before Ryan's grandma overheard the two talking and went in to see why Ryan was up in the middle of the night. And when Ryan's grandma walks in, she just tells Blake and Ryan that she has to tell Ryan's mom that Blake had snuck in through the window and that they had broken the rules. Naturally. When Ryan's grandma goes out of the room to wake up Ryan's mom, Blake asks Ryan, do you want me to stay or do you think I should go? And Ryan told him that it would probably be better for him to just go ahead and leave, so Blake sneaks back out of the window that he came in through. And by the time that Ryan's mom makes it into Ryan's bedroom, Blake was already gone and on his way back to his friend Austin's house. Blake was still texting Ryan after he'd already left. He was also texting Ryan's mom, letting her know that he was so sorry. That he'd never pull anything like that again, and he was obviously upset, and I guess Ryan's mom could tell he was upset, because she ended up telling Blake that she knew that he was a good kid and that everything would be okay, not to worry too much about it, just to be safe, whatever. So Ryan's mom handled this situation like a boss because she kind of let him know that she felt disrespected, but she also understood that they were teenagers and that they do stupid things and that she forgave him. And while Blake is texting Ryan's mom, he's also still texting his girlfriend Ryan. And he's apologizing to her too. So he's simultaneously texting Ryan and her mom, like rapid texting them. And then something weird happens, and it's something that still, to this very day, nobody can explain, and it does not make sense. Blake sent a text to Ryan and told her that he was being pulled over by the police, which is weird because Blake was on foot walking. And I looked into this a little bit more, and back in 2011, it seems like Georgia had a curfew set for anybody under the age of 18, and Blake was only 17. So that may have been why he was stopped, but at the same time, there is also no record anywhere of any police stopping Blake that night. There's no incident report, and even if the cop didn't make a report about the stop, it still should have been in the computer somewhere where Blake's name was run or for something. I feel like police are supposed to document every interaction with every person, no questions asked, for this reason. In text messages Blake had sent, he does say that the officer stopped him, got his name, and then told him that he was breaking curfew before the officer let him go. And even after Blake was reported missing and his body was found, there was still never an officer that came forward and said, oh yeah, that was me. I didn't run his name, but I did stop him because, to see why he was out after curfew. But not one officer's come forward, even after all these years. And this stop by the police officer happened somewhere around the 5:30 a.m. mark that morning after the dance. And I went down a rabbit hole while I was researching this case, and I saw so many theories saying that this so-called police that had stopped Blake either wasn't a real police officer or that it possibly could have been somebody who had been following him. And the only thing I could find to make either one of those theories work is the fact that there was a post made on Blake's social media account. And it said something along the lines of Earl hits like a little bitch or something like that. And this was probably just the only way that Blake, at the age of 17, felt like he was getting back at Earl for all the humiliation that he'd caused him to suffer through at the park full of people watching while Earl and a couple of his grown buddies beat the ever-living shit out of Blake. So that comment that Blake made on his social media account about Earl hitting like a bitch was only one thing that Blake had posted on his social media account, though. He had also posted about how excited he was to go to the homecoming dance at his new school with his new girlfriend, who he was just smitten by. And people wonder if maybe Earl had something to do with what happened to Blake. They often wonder if Earl had seen this post on Blake's social media account, because if so, that would have given him an exact date, time, and location of where Blake would have been on the day that he went missing. So if this is the case, Blake would have essentially given his thought-to-be murderer an exact pinpoint of where to find him. This post or comment was made the day before the school homecoming dance. So if somebody was kind of stalking Blake's social media accounts, they would have seen these posts. Blake would go missing the very next day in the early morning hours, and now, even after all this time, Blake's mom, Melissa, remembers telling Blake that he had to cut this shit out because she could not live without him. And this was a comment that she'd made to her son that still haunts her every day. I feel like we've all felt some type of way towards the shit our kids are doing and telling them these exact same words. We just never think it's going to be anything more than an overused figure of speech. So after this police stop, Blake would text his girlfriend a few more times that night on his walk back to Austin's house. He sent a text to Ryan that said something along the lines of, "I love you, and no matter what happens, I'll always love you." And then again, to tell her that it was freezing outside while he was walking back, to Austin's house. And people wonder if Blake texting Ryan the "I love you no matter what happens" text was his way of saying that he knew something was going to happen and he wouldn't be around to tell her that again. But I almost feel like there's only two reasons he would have sent this text, and that would be that, one, he wasn't sure if Ryan's parents were going to let them continue to date. He had just snuck into their house in the middle of the night, or the fact that this was something he wanted to cross off of his bucket list. One of the items on his bucket list was tell somebody how you really feel about them. That makes sense. So I feel like people are looking a lot more into these texts than what they're actually meant to be, but I could be so wrong about that. So after the "I love you" text and the "I'm freezing" text that came in at about 5:20 a.m., Blake stopped responding to any text, and that was the last text that was sent from Blake's phone was the one that said how cold it was outside. Nobody really realized that Blake was missing until Blake's mom got a call at about 11 a.m. on the morning of October 16th in 2011. And this call came from Blake's friend Austin. Austin told Melissa that he just got up and Blake was gone and that he wasn't answering any of his texts. Austin also had to tell Melissa about Blake sneaking out to go visit Ryan in the middle of the night, and if there's one surefire way to tell a teenager boy is missing, it's for the said teenage boy to miss plans with his new girlfriend the next day. And in Blake's case, that's exactly what happened. Blake and Ryan had planned to hang out the same morning at 11 o'clock, but Blake was a no-show. Melissa went to the Noonan police station to officially report Blake missing somewhere around lunchtime on October 16th. As the investigation progressed, there was a gas station employee that claimed to have seen Blake in the early morning hours in the morning that he went missing at around 7:30 a.m. That Blake had stopped and asked this cashier what time the store opened. The cashier told Blake that the store didn't open until 8, so Blake left again on foot. Now, this sighting would have been a little over 2 hours after Blake had stopped responding and sending text messages, but there was another gas station where Blake was also claimed to have been seen at around 9:30 a.m., which would have been 2 more hours after he was supposedly spotted at the first gas station asking what time the store opened. But neither one of these sightings have ever been confirmed to be Blake, and from what I could find, neither one of these gas stations were asked to turn over their surveillance cameras, and the gas stations have changed owners and names since Blake's disappearance, so that really wouldn't do any good at this point. Which seems weird that they didn't check the surveillance cameras anywhere and everywhere on the route that, on any of the routes that Blake may have taken. Most businesses record over footage like 24 to 48 hours after it's first recorded. So that would be something that you would need to get ASAP if there's any chance of seeing or finding something on surveillance systems in the area. Blake's phone location and cellular data pings were never traced as far as I could find, and no one's even sure of which route Blake had walked home from Ryan's house in the, early morning hours. But every possible route was searched extensively with absolutely no luck whatsoever. Blake was missing for exactly 2 months and 3 days before his body was found. It was on December 19th, 2011, when a jogger came across what they believed to be a body in a creek near a bridge in the Summer Grove area. The Summer Grove area is close by to where he would have been staying at Austin's house on the night that he went missing. After Noonan police were able to exhume the body, they were able to identify the body of 17-year-old Blake Chappell. Blake's body was presumably only in that body of water where he was found for no longer than a week before he was found. But he had been missing for a little over 2 months at the time that his body was found. So it's believed that Blake's body was in the water for no longer than a week. So what happened during that, those other weeks that he had been missing for? Had he been alive and been held somewhere? Had he been killed and hidden and his body preserved until he was put in the body of water? Like, what happened to Blake during the rest of the time that he was missing for? Nobody seems to be able to answer that question, not even the police. And no time of death was ever able to be determined. Blake was only able to be identified by the small Playboy bunny tattoo on his chest and the snake-bite lip piercings. It was determined that Blake had been shot in the head execution style, which means in the back of the head, and Blake was shot with a gun at least once, and the gun was between a .22 and a .45 caliber. Police do think that Blake was killed somewhere besides where he was found, but no exact spot has ever been determined. So they definitely don't think he was killed in or near the body of water where he was found. They're just not sure where he was killed at. And surely to God they would have checked all the bodies of water near where he went missing at. And there was no sign of his body ever found until the jogger stumbled across his remains. Blake's time of death is listed as unknown on his death certificate, but the manner of death was definitely listed as homicide. Blake was found wearing nothing but his underwear and a white kind of undershirt type of deal, and all of his personal items like his phone and wallet were never found. Something else that was never found was the jacket that Austin had loaned Blake before Blake left to walk to his girlfriend's house, and the keys that Austin had given Blake, they were never found either. So, none of these things have been found to this day. Blake reportedly had a backpack with him the night of the dance. Nobody's sure if he left it at Austin's house or maybe in his girlfriend's mom's car, but Austin believes that if it was at his house that it had to have been lost when they moved. Because Austin and his family moved sometime after Blake went missing, which if you've ever moved, you know that you lose things and you never see them again and you never figure out exactly how or where they got misplaced at. So I get that. Now, as far as Blake's girlfriend and her parents go, even though they were presumably the last ones to see Blake alive, and even though the last time they saw him, he had snuck into their house, in their daughter's room, the police have done their part and they've cleared that entire family. They've searched Ryan's family's home, and they've given the entire family polygraph test on multiple occasions. They've never found not even so much as an inkling of evidence to point to anyone in Ryan's family being involved. Now, as far as Earl goes, Blake's ex-girlfriend's stepdad, he has supposedly been cleared by the police and is not considered a suspect in Blake's case. There are actually no suspects in Blake's case whatsoever, and this case has been at a standstill forever. Nobody has still been able to identify the officer of any department that could have been the one that stopped Blake, in the early morning hours right before he went missing. And as far as Blake's friend Austin goes, it doesn't seem that he would have any motive or anything. From what I could find, they've been able to clear Austin and his family as well. And I've been thinking about this case a lot. And, maybe somehow Earl had seen these posts and comments that Blake made the day before the dance and he would have known where he would have been. But even that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Just because even if Earl somehow saw that post or comment and it pissed him off enough to go out looking for Blake again, how would he have known that Blake was going to be walking at 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning to sneak into his new girlfriend's house? He wouldn't. He would absolutely not be able to know exactly where Blake had planned to be and when. Hell, I don't even think Blake knew what he was planning on doing that night. That's basically where this case is. If you or anyone you know or, anybody you know that was in the area or lives in the area now of Noonan, Georgia between October 15th and December 19th in 2011, or if you even think you know something, please reach out to the Noonan Police Department by calling 770-254-2350, or you can also get in touch with the Crime Stoppers of Greater Atlanta, and I'm sure you can remain anonymous. You can call the Crime Stoppers of Greater Atlanta by calling 404-577-8477 or 404-577-TIPS. And I think that's all I have for you this week. Please remember to rate and review the show wherever you're listening. It really does help people find the show. I wasn't aware of that, but apparently it does. I did some digging. And you can also follow me on any social media account. You can search Momma Murdered A Podcast on Facebook, and on every other social media platform, you'll find me by searching murdered_mama. And I think that's that on that this week, y'all. I'm sorry this is late. I really didn't think it was going to make it out today, but I did the damn thing. So, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.